August 3rd, 2010. A little past 7 in the morning. A beer driver in Manchester, Connecticut signs the papers that end his job, then asks for a glass of water. He had no record of violence, no complaints on file, no warning anyone believed. The company said the meeting was over. His lunchbox said it wasn't. And behind that gap, between the routine that should have ended quietly and the co-workers who never went home, these are the 10 workplace disputes that ended with murder. Case 1. Patrick Sherrill. Patrick Henry Sherrill had been born in Watonga, Oklahoma, on November 13, 1941, and had spent most of his life in and around the Oklahoma City area. By the accounts of people who knew him, he had grown into a quiet and socially awkward man, someone who kept to himself and did not form easy friendships. He had served in the United States Marine Corps and later joined the Oklahoma Air National Guard, where he became a member of a pistol team and earned a reputation as an expert marksman. Firearms were the one area of his life where he seemed comfortable and competent. He owned several handguns. He spent time at shooting ranges. Among co-workers who noticed such things, his skill with a pistol was known, and it was one of the details that later made people shudder when they thought back on the offhand comments he had made in the weeks before the shooting. His job at the Edmond Post Office was that of a relief carrier, sometimes called a substitute carrier. It was not the same as holding a permanent, assigned route. A relief carrier fills in on whatever route needs covering on a given day, and which routes a person is offered depends on where he ranks on the seniority list. For Sherrill, this meant that his work changed from day to day, that he did not have the stability of a single familiar route, and that he sat near the bottom of a system in which the people with the most years got the first and best choices. It was the kind of arrangement that could grind on a person over time, a daily reminder that he was near the bottom of a ladder he could not seem to climb. What is harder to settle, even now, is how good a worker Sherrill actually was. Sources that have looked back on the case disagree on this point. Some describe him as an erratic and irritable employee who struggled with his performance, drew customer complaints about misdelivered mail, and clashed with the people who supervised him. Others describe a man who did his job well enough and felt he was being singled out and picked on by management, badgered over small things until the pressure became unbearable. The truth may well contain pieces of both pictures. What is clear from the record is that he had received more than one warning, that he had a history of friction with his supervisors, and that in the days before August 20th, the tension between Patrick Sherrill and the management of the Edmond Post Office had reached a point that neither side could ignore. On the afternoon of Tuesday, August 19, the day before the shooting, 2 supervisors reprimanded Sherrill over his job performance. Their names were Richard Esser Jr. and Bill Bland. The reprimand concerned complaints about his work, including problems with mail on his route. By some accounts, one of the supervisors told him that his future with the Postal Service would be discussed the following day. To a man already anxious about his standing, that kind of statement can land like a sentence. Sherrill appears to have taken it as a signal that he was about to be fired. He left work that afternoon carrying the weight of that meeting, and something in him seems to have hardened into a decision. The warning signs in hindsight were there, though they were the kind of signs that are almost impossible to read correctly in the moment. Sherrill had, on more than one earlier occasion, spoken of getting revenge. Co-workers had grown uneasy around him over the years. Some later recalled dark jokes that circulated about him, the sort of gallows humor that suggested he might one day come back and start shooting. At the time, comments like that were treated as the grim office humor that people used to make an uncomfortable co-worker into a punchline. Only afterward did anyone realize that the jokes had been describing exactly what was going to happen. On the evening of August 19th, after the reprimand, Sherrill reportedly told 2 co-workers something that would take on a terrible meaning the next morning. He warned them that if he was disciplined or let go on his next shift, he would never carry his mailbag again. It was a veiled threat, and it went unrecognized. That night, Patrick Sherrill prepared. He gathered 3 semi-automatic pistols. 2 of them were large .45 caliber handguns based on the classic military design, one made by Colt and one by another manufacturer. The third was a smaller .22 caliber Ruger. He collected extra magazines and a supply of ammunition. Because he was a postal worker, he had access to the most ordinary and least suspicious way imaginable to carry all of it into the building without drawing a second glance. He placed the weapons and the ammunition inside mail carrier bags, the same canvas satchels that every carrier slung over a shoulder every single day. A man walking into a post office with a mail bag was the most normal sight in the world. On the morning of August 20th, Sherrill arrived at the post office just before his shift, a little after 7 o'clock. He came in through the employee entrance carrying his bags. Once he was inside, he did something that transformed the building from a workplace into a trap. He locked the doors behind him, sealing the exits so that the people inside could not easily get out, and so that no one from outside could easily get in. Then he took out one of the pistols. His first target was chosen. He went after Richard Esser Jr., one of the two supervisors who had reprimanded him the day before, and shot him. Esser was 38 years old. After that first killing, Sherrill went looking for the other supervisor, Bill Bland. In one of the strange, small mercies that sometimes turn up inside the worst events, Bland was not there. He had overslept that morning and was running about an hour late. By the time he would have arrived, the shooting was already over. The man Sherrill most wanted to find had been saved by an alarm clock that did not do its job. Unable to find Bland, Sherrill did not stop. He moved through the workroom, through the aisles between the sorting cases, and continued to fire. One of the people he killed was a carrier named Paul Michael Rockne, known as Mike, who happened to be the grandson of the famous Notre Dame football coach Knut Rockne. Others fell as they tried to run, as they tried to hide beneath desks and behind equipment, as they froze in disbelief at the sound of gunfire inside a building where the loudest ordinary noise was the thud of a stamp. Witnesses would later describe how methodically he moved, how he seemed to search for people, how in some cases he fired at victims more than once, even after they were already down. In under 15 minutes, he shot 20 people. 14 of them died. 6 survived their wounds. The dead included supervisors, clerks, and carriers, people who had come to work that morning to do an ordinary shift. Among them were Richard Esser Jr., the supervisor he had targeted first, a clerk named Patricia Gabbard, who was 47, rural carriers including a man named William Miller, who was 30, and Kenneth Morey, who was 49, and Mike Rockne. Each of them had a family, a route, a locker, a place in the daily rhythm of that building. The oldest and the youngest among them were separated by decades, but they died in the same few minutes, in the same rooms, at the hands of a man they had worked beside. As police reached the building and began to force their way inside, the shooting ended the way many of these events end. Patrick Sherrill turned one of his own pistols on himself and fired a single shot into his forehead. He was found dead inside, among the people he had killed. He left no note, no letter, no manifesto explaining himself. Everything anyone would ever be able to say about why he did it would have to be reconstructed afterward from his history, from the reprimand, from the accounts of the people who had worked with him, and from the internal reviews that followed. He took the full answer with him. The scale of what happened in Edmond that morning was almost impossible for the country to absorb. At the time, it was one of the deadliest mass killings by a single person in a single incident in American history, and it remains the deadliest workplace shooting carried out by a lone gunman in the United States. In the state of Oklahoma, it stood as the deadliest shooting by one person until later tragedies, and the memory of it settled into the community as a permanent wound. A town that had thought of itself as a safe and orderly place, the kind of suburb people moved to precisely because nothing like this happened there, had to learn that the danger had been inside the building all along, wearing the same uniform as everyone else. The Edmond Post Office massacre left a mark on the language itself. In the years that followed, as a series of other violent incidents involving postal employees occurred across the country, the grim phrase "going postal" entered common speech as a way of describing a worker who erupts into violence. It became a punchline, a shorthand, a joke told in offices everywhere. The people who lived through the actual mourning in Edmond, the survivors and the families of the dead, never found it funny. Behind the phrase were real names, real routes, real lockers that were cleaned out and reassigned, and a memorial that the town would eventually build to make sure the victims were remembered as more than the origin of a cruel expression. The killings also forced the Postal Service and the federal government to confront the question of how something like this could have been allowed to happen. In March 1987, less than a year after the shooting, A joint congressional hearing examined the events of August 20 and what they revealed about the working conditions, the management practices, and the safety of postal facilities. The Edmund massacre turned out to be part of a larger and disturbing pattern. Over the years that spanned roughly from 1986 through the end of the 1990s, there were more than a dozen separate homicide incidents involving postal employees, and taken together, they claimed the lives of dozens of workers. That pattern drove a wave of studies by criminologists, psychiatrists, and federal agencies into what came to be called workplace violence. New practices around hiring, employee management, and facility safety grew out of that research. Federal law concerning the killing of federal employees was expanded in the mid-1990s. The idea of screening for warning signs, of taking threats seriously, of paying attention when a coworker talks about revenge, became part of how large workplaces thought about their own people. What lingers most about the Edmund case is how ordinary the ingredients were. There was no grand conspiracy, no dramatic betrayal, no fortune at stake. There was a man who felt himself sliding toward the bottom of a system he could not master, a job that offered him no stability and no route to call his own, a reprimand on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, and the fear, real or imagined, that he was about to lose the one thing that gave his days a shape. There was a skilled marksman with a collection of pistols and easy access to a building full of people he blamed for his troubles. And there was a bag, the most familiar object in his working life, that carried his weapons past everyone without a single suspicious glance. The people who died did nothing to deserve it. Most of them had no direct part in his grievance at all. They were simply there, at their cases, working the morning mail, when a co-worker walked in, locked the doors, and turned the reprimand of the day before into the last event of their lives. The Edmund post office reopened. New carriers took over the routes. The town built a memorial to the 14 who were killed, so that their names would outlast the phrase the tragedy had inspired. Bill Bland, the supervisor who overslept and lived, carried for the rest of his life the knowledge of how close he had come, and the weight of being the man Patrick Sherrill had gone looking for and failed to find. And the country, which had never before seen a workplace turned into a killing floor on quite this scale, learned a lesson it would be forced to learn again and again in the decades that followed. The most dangerous person in a building is not always the stranger at the door. Sometimes it is the one who already has a key, a locker, and a reason, real or imagined, to believe he has been wronged. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves east to a printing plant in downtown Louisville, Kentucky, where a longtime pressman named Joseph Westbecker had been sent home on disability leave. On a September morning in 1989, he walked back into the building he no longer worked in, carrying an AK-47 and a duffel bag full of ammunition, looking for the managers he blamed for everything. Case 2. Joseph Westbecker. Joseph Thomas Westbecker had been born in Louisville on April 27, 1942, into a life that seemed determined to knock the ground out from under him at every turn. His father, a construction worker, died in a fall when Joseph was only 13 months old. His mother was just 16 when she was widowed, far too young to raise a child on her own, and the boy was passed from relative to relative through his early years, at one point placed in an orphanage for almost a full year. The grandfather he had grown close to died when Joseph was 4. He struggled in school and dropped out in the 9th grade, though he later pulled himself back and earned his high school equivalency. In 1960, at 18, he went to work as a pressman at a printing plant, and the following year he married. He and his wife had 2 sons. In 1971, he took a job at Standard Gravure, and there, by the accounts of the people who worked alongside him, he became known as a determined, hard-working, loyal and reliable employee. Co-workers called him Rocky. For a long stretch of years, the printing plant was the steadiest thing in a life that had never known much steadiness at all. Behind that reliable exterior, though, Westbecker carried a heavy and worsening burden. He suffered from serious mental illness, and over time it deepened into a diagnosis of depression and manic depression, the condition now more often called bipolar disorder. His inner life was marked by long stretches of darkness. In the years before the shooting, The record shows a man who attempted to take his own life again and again by a range of methods, and who had told doctors of thoughts not only of ending his own life, but of harming others. Roughly 5 years before the shooting, he was hospitalized for the first time after 2 suicide attempts and after confessing that he was having homicidal thoughts. This was a man in genuine and prolonged crisis, and the workplace that had once anchored him was, in his mind, becoming the very source of his pain. The plant itself had changed in ways that made everyone uneasy. Standard Gravure's business had been sliding for years. Many of its customers were retailers that were themselves going out of business, and the industry was hit by paper shortages. Falling revenue led to a wage freeze in 1982, and in 1986, the family that had long owned the company sold it. For the workers, all of this meant pressure, uncertainty, and a sense that the ground was shifting under a job they had counted on. For a man already fighting to hold himself together, the atmosphere of decline was one more weight he did not have the strength to carry. Wesbecker came to believe that he was being singled out. He felt that management was assigning him to the most stressful positions on purpose, and that his mental condition was being used against him rather than accommodated. In particular, he was troubled by an assignment to run a piece of equipment known as the folder, a demanding station that he found unbearable. He asked to be moved to a different position. His request was denied. The sense of grievance grew until, in May 1987, he took formal action, filing a complaint with the Jefferson County Human Relations Commission. In that complaint, he charged that he was being harassed and discriminated against because of his psychological state, and that he was being deliberately placed under conditions designed to break him down. A subsequent examination confirmed that he did indeed suffer from depression and manic depression, which substantiated his claim that he was a person with a genuine mental illness. The dispute between Joseph Wesbecker and Standard Gravure was now on the record, framed in the language of harassment and discrimination, and it would never be resolved in any way that gave him peace. His condition continued to decline. In August 1988, he stopped working altogether, and in February 1989, he was placed on long-term disability leave. There was, at least on paper, an understanding that the company would take him back once he had recovered sufficiently. But recovery did not come. Instead, during the same period, Wesbecker began buying weapons. Between the late summer of 1988 and the spring of 1989, he acquired several firearms, among them the rifle and the pistol he would eventually carry into the plant. A man on disability leave for severe mental illness, a man with a documented history of suicide attempts and homicidal thoughts, was quietly assembling an arsenal, and no system existed to notice or to intervene. The final blow, the one that seems to have pushed him from despair toward action, appears to have arrived in the form of a letter. Shortly before the shooting, Wesbecker is believed to have received notice from the company that his disability income was being cut off. For a man whose entire dispute with his employer had come to feel like a war of attrition, the cancellation of that income would have read as the last betrayal, proof that the institution he blamed for his suffering was now going to take away even the money that kept him afloat. He showed up at the plant for what would be the last time on September 13th, the day before the attack. His mental state in those final days was visibly collapsing. Just 3 days before the shooting, on September 11th, he sat in a session with his psychiatrist and told the doctor a deeply disturbing story about his time on the folder. He claimed that a foreman had humiliated and degraded him in front of his co-workers, forcing him into a sexual act as a condition of being taken off the machine he hated. Whether the account was literally true has never been established, but it reflected the depth of the shame and rage he was carrying. The psychiatrist's notes from that same session describe a patient who seemed to have deteriorated, who wept during the appointment, and who showed an increased level of agitation and anger. The doctor stopped his medication and urged him to check himself into a hospital. Wesbecker refused. There was nothing in the system that could force him, and so he went home, still armed, still convinced that he had been wronged beyond repair. He had begun taking the antidepressant Prozac only weeks before, in August 1989, and that detail would later become the center of a long legal battle. But whatever role the medication may or may not have played, the larger truth was that a gravely ill man, with a burning workplace grievance and a bag full of guns, had been left alone with his intentions. On the morning of September 14th, Wesbecker drove downtown and parked his car in front of the main entrance of Standard Gravure. He entered the building at 8:38 in the morning, carrying a Chinese-made semi-automatic version of the AK-47, a 9mm pistol, and a duffel bag that held additional weapons, a bayonet, and several hundred rounds of ammunition. He was not there to work. He was there to find the people he held responsible. He took the elevator up to the executive reception area on the 3rd floor, the part of the building where the managers and executives had their offices. As the elevator doors slid open, he opened fire immediately. The first 2 people he shot were receptionists. One of them, Sharon Needy, was killed. The other, Angela Bowman, was struck in the back and paralyzed by the wound. Wes Becker moved through the executive floor, searching for the company's president and for the supervisors and managers he blamed. He walked the hallways and fired deliberately at the people he encountered. He killed a man named James Husband. He wounded several others, including a bindery supervisor named John Stein, who was shot in the head and the abdomen and who would survive only after a long and brutal recovery. From the executive floor, he moved downward into the heart of the plant, into the press room where the great machines stood and where he had spent so many years of his working life. There he killed a pressman named Paul Sally and wounded 2 maintenance workers. He continued down into the basement, where he killed a man named Richard Barger. Then he climbed back up to the press room floor, and there the killing intensified. He shot and killed James Weibel, Lloyd White, William Ganote, and Kenneth Fentress. In all, across the executive offices, the press room, and the basement, he shot 20 people. 8 of them died. Then, in his final act, Joseph Wesbecker placed a pistol beneath his chin and ended his own life on the press room floor. The building he left behind was a scene almost beyond comprehension for the city that surrounded it. When the emergency calls went out, describing shots fired and explosions on the upper floors, the response was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of it. So many people had been hit that the city ran out of ambulances. The mayor of Louisville at the time rushed from City Hall to the plant and helped carry stretchers of the wounded out to the street with his own hands. Police officers who entered the building had never trained for anything like it, because in 1989, nothing like it was supposed to happen. Workplace mass shootings were not yet a category of event that ordinary Americans understood. The men and women of Standard Gravure had walked into an ordinary Thursday shift, and the survivors would spend the rest of their lives carrying what they saw. Those survivors carried more than memories. One woman who had been working in the human resources area that day, filling in as a floater, came face to face with Wes Becker in a hallway. She would later describe how the 2 of them simply stood and looked at each other, and how she felt in that moment that whatever makes a person human had already gone out of him. She was shot 4 times, spent 2 weeks in the hospital, and lived for decades afterward with the physical and emotional wounds. The bindery supervisor who had been shot in the head had to relearn how to walk, how to talk, how to say his own alphabet. He remembered almost nothing of the day itself. Among his first pieced-together words in the hospital, after a famous college basketball coach called to encourage him, was a mild expression of astonishment at being alive at all. In the aftermath, the case took a turn that would keep it in the courts and the headlines for years. Because Wes Becker had begun taking Prozac shortly before the shooting, the wounded and the families of the dead brought a lawsuit against the drug's manufacturer, Eli Lilly and Company, arguing that the antidepressant had contributed to his violence. The case went to a jury trial in 1994. On its face, the jury found in favor of the drug company, voting 9-3 that Prozac was not to blame. For a time, that verdict was held up as proof of the drug's safety. But the story did not end there. Years later, it came to light that Eli Lilly had secretly reached a financial arrangement with the plaintiffs during the trial, quietly paying them a large sum in exchange for the handling of certain damaging evidence, all of it concealed from the judge who was presiding over the case. That judge fought publicly to expose what had happened, insisting that the hidden deal had tainted the verdict. The revelation turned a workplace tragedy into a landmark controversy about the pharmaceutical industry, about how such lawsuits are resolved, and about how much the public is ever truly told. For all the legal complexity that followed, the survivors themselves came to their own conclusions about what had happened inside that plant. Some of them, remarkably, refused to lay the whole of the blame on the man who pulled the trigger. choosing instead to see him as a sick man who had gone to doctors for help and had not gotten enough of it in time. Others pointed to the years of what they described as bullying and mistreatment on the plant floor, the sense that a fragile man had been picked at until something inside him gave way. Both of those views can be held at once without excusing what he did. The record shows a person in profound and untreated crisis, a workplace in decline and under strain, a formal grievance that went nowhere, a disability arrangement that was cut off, and an easy path to firepower that no one blocked. Every one of those threads ran straight into the press room floor on the morning of September 14. Joseph Westbecker was buried in Louisville's Cave Hill Cemetery. The standard gravure plant did not survive the memory of what had happened inside it. The building was eventually demolished, and today there is an empty space downtown where the presses once ran, a piece of pavement that carries no marker to tell a passerby that 8 people were killed there. The shooting is remembered as the deadliest workplace shooting in Kentucky's history and as one of the earliest events of its kind in the country, a grim preview of a pattern that would repeat itself again and again in the decades to come. The people who lived through it have spent the years since trying to make sure the 8 who died are remembered as more than a statistic in a lawsuit, and more than the answer to a question about a drug. They were pressmen and receptionists and maintenance workers and supervisors, people who had come to work to run the machines and greet the visitors, and who never imagined that the most dangerous person in the building would be a co-worker they had known for years, walking back in through the front door with the grievances of a lifetime slung over his shoulder. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves west to a family restaurant in Aurora, Colorado, in the winter of 1993. A 19-year-old cook who had been let go months earlier walked back in near closing time, hid in a bathroom until the last customers were gone, and waited for the young employees mopping the floors to be left alone. Case 3. Nathan Dunlap. The grievance that ended 4 lives was almost nothing. Nathan Dunlap had worked as a cook at a Chuck E. Cheese's restaurant in Aurora, Colorado, for roughly 2 months in the summer of 1993, before he was fired in July, and the reason was the kind of small friction that fills the daily life of every restaurant in the country. He had argued with a kitchen manager over his work hours and his schedule. For almost anyone else, that would have been a bad memory and a job that did not work out. For Dunlap, it became a debt he decided had to be paid in blood. On the night of Tuesday, December 14, 1993, about 5 months after losing that job, he walked back into the restaurant near closing time, hid until the last customers were gone, and killed 4 of the young employees who had been left behind to clean up. A 5th was shot in the face and survived only by playing dead. Dunlap was 19 years old, and by the time he committed the killings, he already carried a history that few people ever survive intact. He had been born on April 8, 1974, and was raised by his biological mother and an adoptive father who married when he was young. Both parents, according to accounts that later emerged in court, were abusive. His adoptive father, a large man who had once played professional football and weighed well over 300 pounds, was described as especially violent toward Nathan, throwing him against walls, hurling him down hallways, striking him with objects, and beating him. His mother struggled with serious mental illness and was eventually diagnosed with both schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. The family moved to Colorado in 1984, when Dunlap was around 10. His own mind, his attorneys would later argue, bore the marks of both the abuse he suffered and an inherited vulnerability to mental illness. At least twice during his junior high years he attempted to take his own life. When he was 14, his adoptive father asked a school psychologist to evaluate him, and the testing revealed signs of hypomania, an elevated and agitated mental state linked to bipolar disorder. No real treatment followed. No formal diagnosis was pursued. The warning was noted and set aside. By 15, in 1989, Dunlap had already begun committing armed robberies, first with a golf club and later with firearms. So by the time he took the job at Chuck E. Cheese's in May 1993, he was a young man with a violent record, a brutal childhood behind him, and an untreated mental condition no one had ever addressed. The job lasted only weeks. After the July firing, acquaintances said he was deeply frustrated, and he told at least one former co-worker outright that he planned to get even with the restaurant for letting him go. His mental state appears to have deteriorated sharply in the months that followed. By September 1993, he was showing clear signs of hypomania. He stopped eating and sleeping properly. He grew increasingly wild-eyed and unkempt. During the same stretch, he committed a series of armed robberies. Something in him was spiraling, and the lost job had fixed itself in his mind as the target for everything he was feeling. He had found other work at a nearby fast food place by then, but that did nothing to loosen the grip of the resentment. He still stopped by the restaurant from time to say hello, keeping himself connected to the place while quietly nursing his bitterness toward it. To the teenagers who worked there, he was a familiar face. None of them understood what he was planning. On the evening of December 14th, Dunlap arrived while the restaurant was still open, at around 9 o'clock, and behaved at first like an ordinary customer. He ordered a ham and cheese sandwich. He played an arcade game. He blended into the last hour of a normal business night. But at about 10 minutes before 10, as closing approached, he slipped into a restroom and hid. He waited there while the final customers left, and the doors were locked for the night. The manager who had actually fired him was not working that evening, but Dunlap did not need that particular person to be present. He had come for the restaurant itself, and for whoever was inside it. At around 5 minutes past 10, after closing, he came out of the restroom into a building that now held only its small cleanup crew. He was armed with a .25 caliber semi-automatic pistol. The young employees were scattered through the restaurant, doing the routine end-of-night work of wiping surfaces, vacuuming, and tidying the dining areas. They had no reason to expect danger. They were finishing an ordinary shift. The first person he shot was Sylvia Crowell, who was 19 and was cleaning the salad bar. He came up behind her and shot her at close range in the head. She was mortally wounded, and though she was rushed to the hospital, she was declared brain dead and died the following day. He then shot Ben Grant, only 17, who was in the middle of vacuuming when he was killed by a shot near the eye. He shot Colleen O'Connor, also 17, who understood in her final moments exactly what was happening. She pleaded for her life. She sank to her knees in front of him, begging. He showed her no mercy and killed her with a single shot through the top of her head. He also killed the manager on duty that night, Margaret Kohlberg, who was 50 and the mother of 2 children, shooting her in the manager's office. The 5th employee was Bobby Stevens, who was 20. He had stepped outside for a smoke break, and when he heard noise from inside, he assumed at first that it was the harmless sound of balloons popping, the kind of thing that happened in a place built for children's parties. He walked back in and began unloading utensils into the dishwasher, unaware that 4 of his co-workers were already dead or dying around him. Dunlap came through the kitchen door, raised the pistol, and fired, striking him in the face and jaw. Stevens fell, and had the presence of mind, even wounded, to play dead until Dunlap moved on. That instinct saved his life. Once the shooting stopped, he got up and escaped through a back door, made his way bleeding to a nearby apartment complex, and pounded on a door to alert the people inside that he and others had been shot at the restaurant. He would be the sole survivor, the only living witness among the crew who could describe what had happened. Investigators later found 6 spent shell casings inside the restaurant. Before he left, Dunlap took money and game tokens with him, roughly $1,500 worth of cash, and tokens stolen from the business he had come to punish. The killings had been both an act of revenge and a robbery, and that combination would matter greatly when the case reached a jury. The manhunt did not last long. Dunlap was arrested about 12 hours later, on December 15th, at his mother's apartment. He led authorities to a gym bag he had stashed near a building close to her home. Inside were a semi-automatic handgun, 6 rounds of ammunition, and a pair of gloves. The evidence tied him firmly to the crime, and the picture that emerged was of a planned, deliberate act by a man who had walked into a familiar place, hidden himself, waited for the customers to leave, and then methodically killed the young people left behind to clean up. The scale of it stunned Colorado. At the time, the Chuck E. Cheese's killings were the deadliest mass shooting in the state's history, a distinction that would hold until the Columbine High School shooting in 1999. In later years, Coloradans would come to speak of a series of local tragedies together, linking Columbine, the Chuck E. Cheese killings, and the Century 16 movie theater shooting in Aurora as a shared regional grief. But in December 1993, the murder of 4 young restaurant workers over a firing was almost impossible to comprehend. 3 of the victims were teenagers. The oldest, the manager, had children of her own. They had died not because of anything they had done, but because a former co-worker had decided that his lost job was a debt someone had to pay. Dunlap was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder, along with attempted murder for the shooting of Bobby Stevens, and additional counts of robbery, theft, and burglary. His trial took place in 1996 in Arapahoe County. Prosecutors laid out the case as one of cold, calculated revenge, a young man seeking to get even after being fired, who had entered the restaurant, hidden in a restroom, and emerged after closing to kill. The jury convicted him on all counts. On May 17th of that year, he was sentenced to death by lethal injection, with an additional term of more than 100 years added on top. His behavior at sentencing did nothing to soften the judgment against him. He unleashed a stream of profanity that reportedly lasted around 3 minutes, seeming to confirm for many observers the lack of remorse the prosecution had described. The case moved slowly through the long machinery of the American appeals process, becoming one of the most closely watched death penalty cases in Colorado. Dunlap's attorneys argued in later petitions that he had suffered from undiagnosed bipolar disorder at the time of the crime, and that his childhood abuse and untreated mental illness had never been properly presented at trial. They pointed out that his demeanor had reportedly changed after the state prison system began medicating him in 2006, describing a man who had become capable of genuine remorse. Prosecutors and the victims' families saw the appeals differently, as a decades-long delay of a punishment that had been fairly imposed. One victim's mother said that whether Dunlap died by execution or of natural causes did not matter to her, so long as he left prison only in a pine box. Another said she hoped he would stay exactly where he was and be left to think about what he had done. The case reached its most contentious moment in 2013. By that spring, Dunlap had exhausted his appeals, and the district court in Arapahoe County issued a warrant setting his execution for a window in August. Colorado had not carried out an execution since 1997. Then, on May 22, 2013, Governor John Hickenlooper granted Dunlap what he called a temporary reprieve, postponing the execution indefinitely for as long as he remained in office. Hickenlooper was careful to explain that his decision was not made out of compassion or sympathy for Dunlap, but because he believed there were legitimate questions about whether the state should be taking lives at all, and because he felt Colorado's capital punishment system was flawed. The decision infuriated the families of the 4 victims, who had waited nearly 20 years for the sentence to be carried out, and it became a bitter issue in the state's politics. Some described it as a backdoor form of clemency, a way of sparing a condemned man without formally commuting his sentence. The final resolution came in 2020, when Governor Jared Polis signed a bill repealing the death penalty in Colorado. Along with abolishing capital punishment going forward, he commuted the sentences of the 3 men then on the state's death row to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Nathan Dunlap was one of the 3. In his executive order, police wrote that no punishment, whether death or life without parole, could bring back the victims or lessen the pain and heartache Dunlap had caused, and he framed the decision as a reflection of the state's changed law rather than a comment on the morality of the death penalty itself. The change spared Dunlap's life, but it also meant he would never again be free. He would spend the rest of his years behind bars for what he had done in a single 10-minute span. What remains most difficult to absorb about the case is the smallness of the original spark and the youth of the people it consumed. A disagreement over work hours, a firing most people would have forgotten within a year, became in one troubled mind a debt that could only be settled with murder. The 4 who died had no part in that firing. They were teenagers and a mother, working an ordinary closing shift at a children's restaurant, wiping down a salad bar and running a vacuum and unloading a dishwasher. Bobby Stevens, the one who lived, carried the wound in his face and the memory of playing dead while his co-workers were killed around him, and he was among those most opposed to the reprieve that spared the man who shot him. The Aurora Chuck E. Cheese's became, in the state's memory, one of the places whose name no longer brings to mind pizza and arcade games and birthday parties, but rather the night a fired employee came back through the door with a pistol and a grudge, and turned the end of a shift into the end of 4 young lives. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case crosses the ocean to a Xerox warehouse in Honolulu. A quiet service technician who had spent 15 years repairing copy machines had convinced himself his co-workers were plotting to get him fired over a new machine he refused to learn. On the morning of a routine team meeting, he walked in with a pistol and a plan he had been describing out loud for years. Case 4. Byron Uyasugi. For years before he killed anyone, Byron Uyasugi told people exactly what he was going to do. According to a forensic psychiatrist who examined him before trial, as early as 1995, he was openly talking about carrying out a mass shooting at his workplace if he were ever fired. He complained that his co-workers harassed him, backstabbed him, and spread rumors about him. He said he felt like an outcast among people he was certain were conspiring to have him let go. 4 years later, on the morning of Tuesday, November 2nd, 1999, he walked into a team meeting at the Xerox Corporation building on Nimitz Highway in Honolulu, carrying a 9mm pistol and 2 spare magazines, and in the space of a few minutes, he shot 8 men, killing 7. It remains the worst mass shooting in the history of Hawaii, committed by a 15-year employee who had been warning everyone around him for years and whom no one managed to stop. Uyasugi had been born in Honolulu in 1959 and grew up in the Nuuanu neighborhood. As a young man at Roosevelt High School, he had joined the Army Jurok chapter and the rifle team, and by adulthood he had developed a lifelong affinity for firearms. Classmates remembered him as a quiet student who never got into trouble, unremarkable and reserved. According to his brother Dennis, something changed after high school. Shortly after graduating in 1977, Byron crashed their father's car and struck his head on the windshield, and by his brother's account he was never quite the same again. Whether that injury contributed to what came later has never been settled, but the family marked it as a dividing line, a before and an after. He went to work for Xerox as a service technician in 1984, and it was in the 15 years that followed that his life narrowed into the pattern that would end in murder. According to testimony from his father, Hiroyuki, Byron had been normal until he began working at Xerox, and it was there that his troubles seemed to take root and grow. Away from the job, his life was quiet and solitary. Among his hobbies was the raising and breeding of goldfish and koi, which he sold to local pet stores, a gentle and patient pastime that sat strangely beside the darkness gathering inside him. He also assembled an extensive collection of firearms. At the time of the murders, he had as many as 25 guns registered in his name, some dating back to 1982, and when police later searched the family home, they seized a large number of additional weapons belonging to his father. He was a man deeply comfortable and familiar with guns. Inside the workplace, Uyasugi grew increasingly isolated and paranoid. He came to believe that his co-workers were engaged in patterns of harassment against him, that they left him out on purpose, and that they were working to get him fired. Whether these grievances had any real basis or were largely the product of a mind becoming unwell would be argued for years afterward, but the effect on him was the same. He felt surrounded by enemies. His delusions reached even into his private world, where he came to believe at times that people were tampering with his fish. The line between real workplace friction and imagined persecution blurred in his thinking until he could no longer tell one from the other, and everyone around him became a suspect in a plot he was certain existed. The warning signs were not hidden. As early as 1993, his anger had erupted into an incident at work in which he kicked an elevator door and threatened his supervisor. That episode led to a psychiatric evaluation and anger management, an acknowledgement by the company that something was wrong, and there were the statements themselves, the open talk of a workplace shooting that stretched back years. These were not vague grumbles, they were specific declarations of intent, made in advance, by a man with 24 firearms and a deepening conviction that his co-workers were his enemies. Yet the machinery to stop him did not exist or did not act. The specific dispute that pushed him over the edge involved a copy machine. In the period before the shootings, Xerox management had become increasingly committed to phasing out the type of photocopier Uyasugi had spent years servicing. A newer model was replacing the equipment he knew, and the company wanted him to train on it. He resisted. He feared he could not keep up with the technical demands of the new machine. that he would fail at learning it, and that his failure would hand the company the reason it needed to get rid of him. In his mind, the training was not an opportunity but a trap. For a long time, management worked around his refusal, but eventually the patience ran out. On November 1st, 1999, the day before the shooting, his manager told him plainly that he would begin the training the next day. Uyasugi believed, as he later explained to the psychiatrist who examined him, that if he refused the training, he would be fired. The thing he had feared and talked about for years now seemed to him to be arriving. That night, whatever restraint had held him back for so long gave way. The next morning he came to work carrying the loaded pistol and the 2 spare magazines. He arrived in time for the 8 o'clock team meeting, an ordinary gathering of technicians pulled together to talk about their assignments. At that hour, roughly 11 people were in the building. 2 of the 7 men who would die were in the meeting room, when the others heard a loud explosion of sound, looked up, and saw 2 of their colleagues shot, and Uyasugi crouched with a gun in his hand. From there he moved through the building, seeking out and killing the rest. Witnesses described hearing the reports, and then discovering the remaining victims where they had fallen. He shot each of them deliberately, using high-velocity hollow-point ammunition, the kind designed to inflict maximum damage. 1 co-worker was fired upon, but managed to escape the building. When it was over, 7 men were dead. They were Jason Balatico, who was 33, Ford Kanehira, who was 41, Ronald Kataoka, who was 50, Ronald Kawame, who was 54, Melvin Lee, who was 58, Peter Mark, who was 46, and John Sakamoto, who was 36. 6 were his co-workers, and 1 was his supervisor. They were all men, and many had young families, wives and children and grandchildren, who would spend the rest of their lives with an empty place at the table. They had come to work that morning for a routine meeting about their jobs, unaware that the quiet technician who bred goldfish in his spare time had been rehearsing their deaths in his mind for years. After the killings, Uyasugi did not turn the gun on himself, as many workplace shooters do. Instead, he fled, driving a Xerox work vehicle away from the building. As word spread through Honolulu, fear rippled across the city. A SWAT team descended on a downtown building where Xerox had additional offices, worried he might continue his rampage there, and the building was evacuated. About 2 hours after the shooting, a jogger spotted him sitting in the work van in the upscale Makiki Heights neighborhood, near the entrance to the Hawaii Nature Center in Makiki Valley, and notified police. Officers cordoned off a wide area around the van, roughly half a mile across, to keep civilians clear of a possible shootout, and a standoff began. Uyasugi sat in the vehicle smoking cigarettes while negotiators tried to reach him. In the end, it was family who ended it. His brother Dennis was brought in to help talk him down, and the appeal worked. After several hours, Byron Uyasugi surrendered without further violence. The legal proceedings that followed forced Hawaii to confront a question with no comfortable answer. Uyasugi was indicted on 1 count of first-degree murder for the 7 deaths, along with 7 counts of second-degree murder and 1 count of attempted second-degree murder for the man who had fled. He pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. His defense argued that he was genuinely deluded, a man who sincerely believed his co-workers had spent years tormenting and sabotaging him. One defense attorney described it as years and years of torment, of conspiracy, of sabotage that, even if it had not actually happened, Uyasugi truly believed had. The defense pointed to his delusions, including the fixed belief that people were tampering with his fish, as evidence that he could not tell right from wrong in the way the law required. The prosecution saw a different man. They agreed that Uyasugi suffered from schizophrenia, but argued that mental illness alone did not make him legally insane or free him from responsibility. The lead prosecution expert testified that while Uyasugi met the criteria for schizophrenia, he did not meet the legal standard for insanity, and had known that what he was doing was wrong. Another prosecution expert, the forensic psychiatrist who had documented the years of talk about a workplace shooting, testified that although the schizophrenia was real, Uyasugi had carried out the shooting deliberately. The prosecutors emphasized the years of premeditation, the fact that he had described this exact act since at least 1995, and the calculation involved in choosing his moment. One of the problems he had faced, the lead prosecutor pointed out, was that his intended victims were rarely all in the same place at the same time. November 2nd, with the team meeting drawing them together, was his opportunity, and he took it. Evidence of the guns, the 24 firearms not used in the shooting alongside the pistol he did use, became part of the case as well, over the objections of the defense. The trial lasted about a month. In the end, the jury rejected the insanity defense. One juror later recalled how quiet and unassuming Uesugi had seemed, how he spoke calmly and without expression, and yet how it became clear as the trial went on that he had known the difference between right and wrong, that he understood such things as the commandments against killing. In August 2000, Byron Uesugi was found guilty of first-degree murder and attempted second-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and ordered to pay restitution to the families of his victims. He appealed, and in 2002, the Hawaii Supreme Court upheld the conviction. He pursued additional avenues of appeal in the years afterward, but the verdict stood. He was ultimately incarcerated at a correctional facility on the mainland, in Arizona, far from the islands where he had lived his entire life. The aftermath reached beyond the courtroom. In 2005, Xerox and the hospital that had examined Uesugi settled a civil lawsuit brought by the families of the victims, who believed both the company and the medical system had failed to take preventive action despite clear signs of his mental instability. The years of talk about a mass shooting, the 1993 elevator incident and psychiatric evaluation, the anger management, the growing isolation and paranoia, all of it had been visible, and the families argued that more should have been done to keep a troubled man with 24 firearms away from the people he had come to see as his enemies. The building on Nimitz Highway where the killings took place was vacated by Xerox and stood empty for years, a place people did not want to occupy, before it was eventually put to other uses. For Honolulu, the murders punctured a sense of safety the city had long held. This was a place, people said afterward, where this kind of thing did not happen, where men simply went to work and did not get shot at point-blank range by a co-worker in a meeting room. The former prosecutor who won the conviction reflected years later that the verdict had been cold comfort, profoundly inadequate against everything that had been lost. 7 families had been left without husbands and fathers and sons. The officers and prosecutors who lived through the case carried it for the rest of their careers, unable to drive past the nature center in Makiki Valley without remembering what had ended there. What stays in the record is the strange, quiet ordinariness of the man at the center of it. A reserve technician who bred goldfish and koi, who had worked for the same company for 15 years, who spoke in a flat and calm voice even while describing the delusions that consumed him. Underneath that surface ran years of festering grievance, a conviction that his co-workers were destroying him, and a fear that a new copy machine and a training session would be the end of his job and his identity. He had told people for years what he intended to do. He had the weapons to do it. And on an ordinary Tuesday morning, when a routine meeting finally gathered his co-workers into one room, he walked in and did the thing he had been describing since 1995. 7 men who had come to talk about their assignments never went home. The most dangerous person in the building had been sitting among them the whole time, quietly waiting for the day they would all be in the same place at once. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a software company in Wakefield, Massachusetts, on the day after Christmas in 2000. A support worker had learned weeks earlier that his wages were about to be garnished to pay a tax debt he insisted he did not owe. He came back to the office after the holiday with an assault rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol, and went looking first for the woman in human resources. Case 5, Michael McDermott. The dispute at the center of this case was, on paper, worth about $5,500. Michael McDermott owed back taxes, and in December 2000, the Internal Revenue Service placed a lien that required his employer, a software company called Edgewater Technology in Wakefield, Massachusetts, to garnish a large portion of his paycheck until the debt was paid. McDermott insisted he did not owe the money. He was upset and angry, and he could not understand why the company had to comply. Over a lifetime, $5,000 is a small sum, but to a man already sliding under the weight of financial trouble and untreated mental illness, the garnishment landed as a final insult, and the people he blamed for it worked in the same building he did. On the morning of December 26, 2000, the day after Christmas, he walked through the office with an assault rifle, a shotgun, and a pistol, and killed 7 of his co-workers. It remains the deadliest mass shooting in the history of Massachusetts. McDermott was born on September 4, 1958, in Plymouth, Massachusetts, and grew up in nearby Marshfield, graduating from the local high school in 1976. A former classmate remembered him as a nice enough young man. After high school, he enlisted in the United States Navy and served for 6 years as an electrician's mate, most of that time aboard a submarine, before being honorably discharged. He went on to work at a nuclear power plant in Maine through the 1980s, then moved into research and development work, at one point contributing to battery patents. He married in 1992. By the standards of a resume, he had a steady and even accomplished working life, a Navy veteran with technical skills who had held responsible jobs. But underneath that surface ran a long history of serious mental illness. He had suffered a severe breakdown after a personal relationship ended during his years at the power plant, an episode that led to multiple hospitalizations for depression. He had attempted to take his own life more than once. For years he had been treated for his condition, prescribed antidepressants, and monitored by a psychiatrist, and the diagnosis that followed him described a man carrying a heavy and persistent psychological burden. He began working at Edgewater Technology in February 2000, taking a job on the application support team and earning a salary in the range of $55,000 a year. At first, the fit seemed good. In a therapy session that March, he told his psychiatrist that he had started at Edgewater and that it was a terrific place. But his financial life was a mess that no salary could fully contain. He struggled with overeating, with unhealthy habits, with credit card debt, and, most consequentially, with the IRS, which claimed he owed back taxes. As the year wore on, his depression deepened again. By the fall, he told his doctor he had been depressed for 2 months, had stopped going to the gym, and was upset because the IRS insisted he owed money. The private crisis and the workplace collided directly in December. On December 14, 2000, McDermott had a conversation at work that would set the final events in motion. He met with Cheryl Troy, who ran the Human Resources Department at Edgewater, and with the company's chief financial officer. They explained that an IRS tax lien of roughly $5,500 required the company to garnish a large portion of his paycheck until the lien was fully satisfied. McDermott claimed he did not owe the IRS anything. He was upset and angry, and he could not understand why Edgewater had to go along with the garnishment. Later that same afternoon, a program manager who oversaw his team tried to help him resolve the tax problem. A few days later, on December 18th, that same manager sat with McDermott through a telephone conference with the IRS, an attempt to sort the matter out that ended when it became clear nothing was going to be resolved. The company had, in fact, decided to hold off on actually enforcing the garnishment until after the Christmas holidays, a small kindness. But the decision had been made, the machinery was in motion, and in McDermott's mind, the people at Edgewater who were complying with the IRS had become the enemy. His preparations in the days before the shooting showed calculation rather than a sudden loss of control. He owned firearms, a fact he had disclosed to his psychiatrist earlier in the year. On Christmas Eve, prosecutors would later show he test-fired his weapons. He spent Christmas Day with his family. Then, on December 25, he stashed the weapons in his cubicle at the office, so they would be waiting for him when he returned to work. He also, in the days before, reportedly asked several co-workers to witness the signing of his will, a chilling detail that would later be cited as evidence of premeditation. This was not the behavior of a man who snapped in a single instant. It was the behavior of a man who had made a decision and was quietly arranging the pieces. On the morning of December 26, McDermott and his colleagues returned to work after the long holiday weekend. Co-workers who spoke with him before the shooting described him as jovial and even happy that morning, giving no outward sign of what was coming. Then, just after 11 o'clock, he retrieved his weapons and began. He carried an assault rifle based on the AK-47 design, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a pistol, and over the course of a few minutes he fired dozens of rounds through the office. He moved through the reception area and into the adjoining offices, shooting his victims repeatedly, often in the back of the head. One eyewitness would later testify that she heard McDermott tell one of the victims that he needed to see someone in human resources before he raised his weapon. Human Resources was the department that had delivered the news about the garnishment, and its head, Cheryl Troy, was among the people he killed. In all, 7 people died: Craig Wood, Rose Manfredi, Jennifer Bragg Capobianco, Louis Chevelle, Paul Marceau, Janice Haggerty, and Cheryl Troy. The building held roughly 80 people at the time, but McDermott's fire was concentrated, and no one beyond those 7 was struck. When it was over, he did not flee and did not turn a weapon on himself. He returned to the reception area, sat down in a chair, and waited. When Wakefield police officers arrived, responding to a flood of 911 calls about shots being fired, they found him sitting erect and motionless, both arms resting on the arms of the chair. His duffel bag was on a nearby couch. The assault rifle lay by his right foot, and the shotgun by his left, both of them out of ammunition. When officers ordered him to raise his hands and get on the ground, he did not respond. When an officer told him to put his hands on his head, McDermott replied that he did not speak German. 2 officers then pulled him to the floor and handcuffed him. That strange remark about German would turn out to be the first hint of the extraordinary defense he would eventually mount. The prosecution's theory was straightforward and grounded in the evidence. Middlesex County prosecutors argued that McDermott had been enraged by the garnishment of his wages for the IRS, and that he had targeted the people involved in his company's compliance with that order. They pointed to his test firing of the weapons on Christmas Eve, his stashing of the guns in his cubicle the day before, the angry outburst co-workers had overheard from him in the company's accounting offices the week before the shooting, and the sheer deliberateness of the killings. The victims, they emphasized, included those connected to payroll and human resources, the very functions responsible for withholding his pay. Investigators recovered a large quantity of unused ammunition scattered across the office and hidden in his desk, evidence that pointed to planning rather than an impulsive eruption. The defense told a very different story. McDermott's attorneys argued that he was not guilty by reason of insanity, pointing to his documented history of schizophrenia and his previous suicide attempts. And then, when the defense opened its case, the courtroom heard for the first time the belief McDermott claimed had driven him. He testified that he believed he had been born without a soul, and that God had given him the chance to earn one by traveling back in time to kill Adolf Hitler and 6 Nazi officers. In his mind, according to the defense, the 7 co-workers he shot were not co-workers at all but Hitler and his men, and by killing them in the offices of a software company in Massachusetts, he believed he was preventing the Holocaust. A retired Wakefield police chief who had responded to the scene would later describe how McDermott had claimed to be hearing voices, even as the physical evidence pointed to careful premeditation. It was one of the most bizarre insanity defenses in the state's history, and the jury did not accept it. The trial took place in the spring of 2002. Jurors deliberated for roughly 16 hours over 3 days before reaching their verdict. They convicted Michael McDermott of 7 counts of first-degree murder, finding that the killings had been committed with deliberate premeditation and with extreme atrocity or cruelty. Because Massachusetts had abolished the death penalty years earlier, the sentence was fixed by law: life in prison without the possibility of parole, imposed for each of the 7 murders. Angry relatives of the victims applauded the verdict, and as McDermott was led from the courtroom, some of them called out to him, telling him to die in there. He appealed his convictions in the years that followed, challenging the search of his apartment and other aspects of his trial, but the Massachusetts High Court affirmed the convictions, and the verdict stood. He would remain incarcerated in a Massachusetts correctional facility. What lingers about the Edgewater case is the collision of 2 things that should never have met. On one side was a private tragedy, a man with a long and genuine history of mental illness, a life of financial disorder, and a mind that had, by his own account, come loose from reality. On the other was an ordinary administrative matter, the kind of thing that happens quietly in payroll departments every day. An employee owes back taxes, the IRS files a lien, the employer, required by law, garnishes a portion of the wages. There was nothing unusual or malicious about any of it. Cheryl Troy and her colleagues were simply doing the jobs the law required of them. But in the mind of Michael McDermott, that routine compliance became a persecution, and the people carrying it out became targets. Whether one believes he was a calculating killer who dressed his rage in a fantasy about Nazis, or a genuinely psychotic man whose delusions happened to fall on his co-workers, the outcome was the same. 7 people who had come back to work after Christmas, expecting nothing more than the slow first day of a holiday-shortened week, were shot dead over a tax debt that would have been paid off, a little at a time, out of paychecks that would have kept on coming. The company planted a cherry tree outside its Wakefield offices in memory of the 7 victims. The case became a subject of study for those who try to understand what drives an employee to turn on the people he works beside, and it took its place in the grim record of American workplace violence as the worst such event Massachusetts had ever seen. Craig Wood, Rose Manfredi, Jennifer Bragg Capobianco, Louis Javel, Paul Marceau, Janice Haggerty, and Cheryl Troy had done nothing to McDermott. Most of them had no connection at all to his tax problem. They were simply present in the building on the morning a co-worker decided that a $5,000 garnishment was a wound that could only be answered with gunfire. The most dangerous person at Edgewater Technology that day had walked in smiling, said good morning, and waited until just after 11 to open the duffel bag he had hidden in his cubicle the day before. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a semiconductor startup in Santa Clara, California, in the fall of 2008. A testing engineer had just been fired, and he came back to the office the same day for a follow-up meeting with the 3 managers who had made the decision. He begged for his job. When they refused, he took out a handgun. Case 6. Jinghua Wu. He begged for his job first. Before Jinghua Wu killed the 3 people who had fired him, he pleaded with them, twice, across a single afternoon, to reconsider. He had been let go from his position as a testing engineer at Scyport, a semiconductor startup in Santa Clara, California, that made chips for high-definition radio. On the afternoon of Friday, November 14, 2008, after the decision had been delivered and he had failed to talk his way out of it, he took out a 9mm handgun he had loaded that same day and shot each of the 3 managers responsible, killing the company's chief executive, its vice president of operations, and its head of human resources. Prosecutors would sum up the case in a single word: revenge. It became one of the deadliest workplace killings in the history of Silicon Valley. Wu was in his late 40s at the time of the shooting, born in China around 1961 or 1962, and his path to that office in Santa Clara ran through some of the most turbulent history of the 20th century. According to his defense attorney, Wu grew up in communist China and lived through the Great Famine of the late 1950s and early 1960s, a period when many people starved. He was a child during the Cultural Revolution, when his family was denounced for earlier ties to the nationalist movement. He was beaten for that association and, on one occasion, shoved into water and nearly drowned by political opponents. The defense would argue that these experiences left him with lasting psychological damage, that he grew up fearful and distressed, that his whole family would hide at home at night to escape the bullying, and that he carried a lifelong depression out of those years. His mother and grandmother, the defense said, had histories of severe mental illness, and Wu himself had suffered from paranoid delusions and had been treated for a serious form of depression, including thoughts of suicide. By the time he reached Silicon Valley, he had built the kind of life that many immigrants work toward. He was a married father of 3 young sons, including a set of 6-year-old twins and a younger boy, and he was known to his friends as Jerry. Those who knew him described him as a smart, unassuming family man. He held a skilled engineering job at Scyport that paid him around $125,000 a year, a comfortable salary that placed him firmly in the middle class of one of the most expensive regions in the country. But by 2008, the ground beneath him was giving way. He had money invested in real estate, and the value of those investments fell steeply during the economic downturn that gripped the country that year. He faced the possibility of bankruptcy, and with it, the kind of humiliation, for himself and his family, that a man of his background would have felt acutely. On top of the financial strain came the loss of the job itself. The defense would later argue that in the period before the shooting, Wu began to have hallucinations and considered taking his own life. Whatever combination of pressures was at work, a man who had spent his life clawing his way up from famine and persecution to a 6-figure engineering salary now saw all of it slipping through his fingers at once. The end of his employment did not come as a single blunt event, but unfolded across the whole of that Friday, a slow and grinding day that gave Wu every opportunity to walk away and that he used instead to arm himself. On the morning of November 14th, the Vice President of Operations, Brian Pugh, and the office manager and human resources head, Marilyn Lewis, held a meeting with Wu to inform him that the company had decided to terminate his employment. The reaction, according to an email Pugh wrote afterward to document what had happened, was immediate and menacing. Wu told Pugh that he would pay for this, that he would see, that he wished him to go to hell, and that he would not escape from the earth. It was, in effect, a threat delivered the moment the decision was announced, and Pugh thought it serious enough to write down. Shortly after, Lewis returned to Pugh's office bringing the chief executive, Sid Agrawal, and another employee. Agrawal apologized to Wu and explained that it had been the board's decision to terminate him, not a personal choice made in that room. Pugh, for his part, complained that he had assigned a project to Wu 5 months earlier and that the task was still incomplete. Wu rejected the blame. He insisted that the delay had not been his fault, that it had happened because Pugh had not assigned the job correctly in the first place. He told them that the firing would devastate him, and he warned them that he would be back. He asked for a 3-month extension, a reprieve that would let him keep the job a little longer. Agrawal asked Wu to give them a few minutes to discuss the matter among themselves. Wu returned to his cubicle and called his wife to tell her that Cyport had fired him. She would later testify that he sounded frustrated and panicked on the phone, that he kept repeating that it was not fair and that they could not do this to him. She tried to calm him, reminding him that she still had her own job and that the family would be all right. Then Wu left the building, and what he did over the next several hours turned a firing into a plan. After lunch, he drove to a shooting range and purchased 2 boxes of ammunition, 50 rounds each, for his 9mm semi-automatic pistol. From there he went to his credit union, where he deposited several checks and withdrew $3,000 in cash. He had been in a car accident about a week earlier and was driving a rental vehicle, and it was in that rental that he now made his way back toward the office. At around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, hours after being told he was fired, Jinghua Wu returned to Cyport wearing a coat and a hat, with the loaded pistol in his pocket. He did not go in shooting. He waited, again, about 45 minutes. Then he went to the office of Sid Agrawal, the chief executive, who at that moment was meeting with Brian Pugh. Marilyn Lewis was there as well. Employees just outside the office overheard fragments of the final exchange. They heard Agrawal say something to the effect that they did not have to do it like that, an apparent last attempt to reach Wu or to find another way through the confrontation. They heard Wu reply that he did not care, that they were just going to send him to jail. After that brief verbal exchange, Wu fired 6 shots. He killed all 3 of them, Agrawal, Pugh, and Lewis, at close range, each of them shot in the head. The 3 people he killed were not faceless authority figures. Sid Agrawal was 56 years old and lived in Fremont. He was the head of the company he had helped build. Brian Pugh, the vice president of operations, was 47 and lived in Los Altos. And by the account of his own sister, he had been someone who tried to work with Wu, who tried to help him, despite what she described as his poor performance on the job. Marilyn Lewis, 67, and from San Jose, was the human resources manager whose role placed her at the center of the personnel decision. All 3 had families. All 3 had come to work that day to run a business and to manage a difficult staffing matter, the kind of thing companies handle routinely, and all 3 of them died, in a single office, in the span of moments, because the man they had let go decided that his firing was a debt to be settled with a gun. What Wu did after the shooting revealed the same cold deliberateness that had marked his afternoon. He did not panic, did not collapse, did not turn a weapon on himself. He exited the building and walked calmly to his car. He called his wife again, this time to tell her that she would have to care for their children because he was going to be gone. Then he turned off his cell phone so that he could not be traced. He drove back to the credit union, where he deposited another check and withdrew another $2,000 in cash. He tried to withdraw $40,000, a sum that would have set him up to run, but the bank declined the request. Unable to get the larger amount, he spent the night alone in his rental car. In the morning, he called his wife one more time. He apologized to her. He told her that he wished to surrender to the police, though he would not tell her exactly where he was. Officers arrested him a short time afterward. When they took him into custody, he was unarmed, and for a period they were still searching for the gun he had used. He had not, by any measure available to the people who investigated the killings, acted in a sudden and uncontrollable frenzy. He had been fired in the morning, threatened the men who did it, gone home to think, come back to plead for an extension, been asked to wait, and then chosen, over the course of an entire afternoon, to drive to a shooting range for more ammunition, to a bank for cash, and back to the office, in a disguise with a loaded pistol in his pocket. The sequence would sit at the center of the case against him, because it was almost impossible to reconcile with the story his defense would eventually tell. Wu was arrested and charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder, along with special circumstances for the multiple killings and for the use of a firearm, enhancements that in California carry the possibility of the harshest sentences the state allows. He was represented by a well-known San Francisco defense attorney with a long history of taking difficult cases. Wu pleaded not guilty and, separately, not guilty by reason of insanity, a 2-track plea that would send the case to a jury in 2 phases, one to decide whether he had committed the killings, and a second to decide whether he had been legally sane when he did. The trial did not come quickly. It was not until early 2013, more than 4 years after the shooting, that the case was heard in Santa Clara County Superior Court in San Jose. The prosecutor laid out the theory of revenge in his opening statement, describing a resentful man who had begged for his job and, when refused, had killed the people responsible. He called the murders planned, purposeful, and premeditated, pointing to the trip to the gun range for ammunition, the return to the office in a coat and hat, and the loaded weapon in the pocket, as proof that this had not been a spontaneous eruption, but a prepared act. He showed the jury graphic autopsy photographs of the 3 victims and their wounds, and walked them through the timeline of the afternoon. The defense told a very different story. Wu's attorney described his client as a law-abiding family man before what he called a horrible episode, and argued that Wu's sufferings in China and his diagnosed mental illnesses had formed the foundation for what he did. The defense said it would present multiple diagnoses from experts describing Wu's mental diseases and defects, and it argued that he had not been sane at the time of the killings. On the stand, Wu offered an account sharply at odds with the physical record. He testified that after he had been fired, he had entered Siport with the intention of taking his own life, not of shooting anyone else. He claimed he could not remember much of what happened, that he had blacked out, that he recalled shooting Pugh but not killing Agrawal or Lewis. He suggested that the violence had begun after Pugh hit him with a chair. He said he was terribly saddened by what had happened and that he regretted it. The defense asked the jury to find reasonable doubt about the murder charges and to convict him instead of the lesser crime of manslaughter. The jury did not accept it. On March 8, 2013, they found Jinghua Wu guilty of first-degree murder on all 3 counts. They also found true the special circumstance allegation that he had committed multiple murders, along with 3 firearm enhancements. After the guilty verdict, the trial moved into its sanity phase, in which the same jury was asked to decide whether Wu had been legally sane when he committed the killings. The jury heard from doctors who testified about his mental state, but in the end, it found him sane as to all 3 counts. The story of a man so shattered that he did not know what he was doing could not survive against the evidence of a man who had spent an afternoon buying ammunition, withdrawing cash, and disguising himself before he pulled the trigger. On August 2, 2013, the court imposed the sentence that state law required. Wu was given life in prison without the possibility of parole for each of the 3 first-degree murders, plus an additional 75 years for the special circumstances, with the sentences to run consecutively. He was also ordered to pay around $30,000 in restitution to the victims' families. In sentencing him, the judge noted that the jury had concluded Wu planned the murders and had reached that conclusion despite hearing testimony about his mental illness. The sentencing hearing gave the families a chance to speak, and their words cut to the heart of what the crime had destroyed. One of them addressed Wu directly, calling him a calculating and selfish man who had shown no remorse, and saying he should never be allowed out because he had no regard for human life. Brian Pugh's sister, Robin, spoke to Wu about her brother, reminding him that Pugh had tried to come to his aid despite his poor performance at work, that Pugh had tried to help him and work with him, and that Wu had killed him anyway. She told him he had destroyed his own family and his own life with his petty feelings and his act of revenge, and she called him a fool. When Wu himself was given the chance to speak, he again claimed he had not planned the murders in advance, repeated that he could not remember the shootings, and again referenced Pugh striking him with a chair. His attorney said outside the courthouse that he planned to appeal, arguing that the court had failed to give adequate weight to Wu's diagnosed mental illnesses as mitigating factors, and challenging the way California law presumed a defendant to be sane. That appeal was pursued through the state's appellate courts in the years that followed, but the conviction stood. The Cyport case sits at an uneasy intersection that runs through many of these stories, the place where genuine suffering meets deliberate, planned violence. There is no doubt that Wu had suffered. The famine, the persecution, the near drowning, the family history of mental illness, the financial collapse of 2008, the loss of his job, all of it was real, and any honest account of the case has to hold it alongside what he did. But the jury also heard the evidence that on the very day he was fired, he had threatened the men who fired him, driven to a shooting range for 100 rounds of ammunition, returned to the office in a coat and hat with a loaded pistol, and then, after another meeting and another plea for more time, killed 3 people and walked calmly to his car to plan his escape. They heard that he had begged for his job, and that when the answer was no, he had answered with a weapon he had already prepared. They concluded that the killings were planned and that he had been sane. The law drew the line where it drew it, and Wu will spend the rest of his life in prison. Cyport itself did not long outlive the tragedy as an independent company. The startup, which had been working to make chips for high-definition radio, was later acquired by a much larger technology firm in 2011. The people it lost, though, could not be acquired or replaced. Sid Agrawal, Brian Pugh and Marilyn Lewis had been part of building something in one of the most competitive industries in the world, and they were killed not by a stranger or a robber, but by an engineer they had employed, over a personnel decision that companies make every day. The killings stunned Silicon Valley precisely because the setting was so ordinary. A small, ambitious tech company, a difficult employee, a firing, a meeting, a plea to reconsider, a request for a few more months. In almost every version of that scene, the story ends with the fired worker packing a box and driving home. In this version, the fired worker drove home, then drove to a gun range, then drove back, and 3 people who had come to work to run their company did not survive the afternoon. He had told them in the morning that he would be back, and no one understood that he meant it as a promise. The most dangerous person at Cyport that day had already been shown the door, and he simply put on a coat and a hat and walked back through it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a beer distribution warehouse in Manchester, Connecticut, in the summer of 2010. A driver who had been caught on video stealing was called into a disciplinary hearing and given a choice: resign or be fired. He signed the resignation papers, asked about his final paycheck, and then walked into the kitchen for a glass of water with 2 handguns hidden in his lunchbox. Case 7. Omar Thornton. He had already signed the papers. By the time Omar Thornton opened fire at Hartford Distributors on the morning of August 3, 2010, the disciplinary matter that brought him there was, on paper, resolved. He had been called into a hearing over accusations that he was stealing beer along his delivery route. He had been shown video footage, taken by a private investigator, of himself loading cases of beer from a delivery truck into a private vehicle. He had been given a choice: resign or be fired. He had chosen to resign, signing the letter, asking questions about future job references and his final paycheck. The meeting had ended calmly. Then, as 3 men escorted him out of the building, Thornton said he wanted to get a glass of water, stepped into the kitchen, took a 9mm handgun out of his lunchbox, and began to kill. In a matter of minutes, he shot and killed 8 co-workers and wounded 2 others before turning a gun on himself. It was the worst instance of workplace violence in Connecticut's history. Thornton was 34 years old, born on April 25, 1976. He had come into the world under the name Omar Kinder and had legally changed his name to Thornton after a paternity test. His early life had been unstable. He had moved from school to school, spent time in special schools for children with problems, and never graduated high school. As an adult, he had held a series of jobs and had been fired from several of them, at least one over allegations of theft. He had filed for bankruptcy in 2000. He was, by the account of people who knew him, described by some as a hard-working and mellow man, and by others as a worker whose effort was lacking, someone his co-workers did not want to work with. He owned pistol permits, and after the shooting it emerged that he had accumulated thousands of photographs of firearms on his home computer, though investigators found no written plan for what he ultimately did. He had been hired at Hartford Distributors, a family-owned wholesale distributor of Budweiser beer products and wine near Manchester, roughly 2 years before the shooting, and worked as a driver, making about $48,000 a year. The distributorship was a well-regarded local business, its owning family respected in Manchester, the kind of company that sponsored local sports teams. It was also a heavily unionized workplace where, according to the police chief who later investigated, nearly everything was governed by seniority under the union contract. That system would become part of the story. When Thornton became a driver, he was the junior driver, which meant that the senior drivers picked their routes first, and the least senior driver was left with whatever route no one else wanted. Thornton, according to the investigation, saw that arrangement as racism. Others in the building saw it as a straightforward contractual obligation, the way the union had always operated. That difference in interpretation lay at the heart of what Thornton would say about his own motive. He was a black man in a predominantly white workforce, and he had complained to family and friends in the weeks before the shooting that he was being racially discriminated against at work. His girlfriend and her mother would later say that he had told them he had seen a photograph on his cell phone of a hangman's noose and a racial slur written on a bathroom wall at the distributorship. His relatives described a man who had reached a breaking point after suffering racial harassment, a man singled out for being black. After the killings, his family said racism had caused him to snap. The company, the union, and his fellow workers strongly denied that account. Company and union officials, along with other workers at the facility, rejected the charge of racism. The union pointed out that Thornton had never filed a complaint with the union or with any government agency about racial harassment, and no complaint had ever been filed against the company with the state's Human Rights Commission. A 10-month investigation by the Manchester Police, which produced a report running to hundreds of pages, found no evidence of the racist graffiti Thornton had described, and no proof of any acts of racism at Hartford Distributors. Other minority workers interviewed by police disagreed with Thornton's characterization of the company as a racist place. The police chief said the investigation found no reports of Thornton having personal disputes with any specific employees, but noted that he had a reputation for a lacking work ethic, that others did not want to work with him, and that he did not seem to accept the seniority system. What the video footage did show, unambiguously, was Thornton removing cases of beer from a delivery truck and loading them into someone else's vehicle. The theft was documented. The racism, in the end, was never substantiated by the investigation. The day of the shooting had been set in motion the day before. Thornton was informed on August 2nd that there would be a meeting at his workplace the next morning. He was not told the reason, but a witness recalled that he looked a little down and guilty. The meeting was for disciplinary purposes. He had been recorded stealing beer, and he was also implicated in the theft of empty beer kegs. On the morning of August 3, Thornton arrived at work carrying a lunchbox. Inside it were 2 9mm handguns. The meeting began minutes later. It was attended by the general manager, Stephen Hollander, a supervisor named Louis Felder, and a union representative named Brian Sirigliano, who was there to represent Thornton's interests as the president of the local Teamsters chapter. During the meeting, Thornton was described as calm. He was shown the video of himself stealing. Given the choice between being fired and resigning, he chose to resign, signing the papers. He asked questions about future job references. The meeting ended with a discussion of customers who had been involved in the thefts and confirmation that Thornton would receive his final payment in the mail. The three men then escorted him out of the building. It was on the way out that Thornton said he was going to get a glass of water and stepped into the kitchen. Felder followed him there, while Sirigliano and Hollander continued down the hallway. In the kitchen, Thornton took out one of the handguns and opened fire. His first 2 shots killed Louis Felder, who was standing just outside the kitchen pleading with him. That first shot also grazed the general manager, Stephen Hollander, on the arm and face. Thornton then moved out of the kitchen and shot Brian Sirigliano, the union representative who had just been in the room advocating for him, killing him in the hallway. From there he moved into the warehouse, where roughly 40 to 70 employees were present during a shift change. He shot Douglas Scruton, who was on a forklift that then crashed into a wall and caught fire. He shot and killed Victor James and Craig Pepin. He chased another worker through the warehouse until he reached a trash compactor area where William Ackerman was working, and there he killed both Ackerman and the man he had been chasing. He entered another room and shot a worker in the shoulder, who managed to run and escape. In just a few minutes, 8 men were dead and 2 more were seriously injured. As police arrived, only 3 minutes after the first 911 call, Thornton retreated and hid in a locked office. Officers had begun entering the building within about 10 minutes. From inside the office, Thornton used a discarded cell phone to call his mother. He told her what he had done and told her he intended to take his own life. According to relatives, his mother spent around 10 minutes trying to talk him out of it. Then he called 911. On that recorded call, he told the operator that his motive was the racism he said he had experienced in the workplace. He said he wished he had killed more people. According to accounts from his relatives, he told his mother in one of those final calls that he had killed the racists who had been bothering him. Soon after hanging up and telling the police he was coming out of the room, Omar Thornton shot himself in the head. The police never fired their own weapons. The 8 men he killed were, by every account, ordinary working people. Brian Sirigliano, 51, was the union president who had served as Thornton's own representative at the hearing that morning. Victor James, 59, had been looking forward to retirement and to spending more time with his daughters and grandchildren. Craig Pepin, 60, was a driver, a father of 4, and a soccer coach for a local travel team. Douglas Scruton, 56, had worked at the warehouse for nearly 30 years and had recently moved with his wife toward a retirement home near the mountains and beaches he loved, staying with a friend during the work week. William Ackerman, 51, was a warehouseman. They had come to work for an ordinary shift change on a summer morning, and they died at the hands of a co-worker who had just resigned, rather than be fired for theft. The case became the center of a national conversation, one that has never fully resolved. Because Thornton had told a 911 operator that his actions were racially motivated, and because his family insisted that racial harassment had driven him to the breaking point, the shooting was seen by some as an act of retaliation against a hostile workplace. Others pointed to the documented theft, the lack of any formal complaint, and the police finding of no evidence of racism, and saw a man who had been caught stealing and had chosen mass murder over accountability. A forensic psychiatrist commenting on the case remarked that in his experience, people did not commit atrocities because of name-calling. The general manager who survived, grazed by Thornton's first shot, said afterward that he could make no sense of it, that 10 seconds before the shooting he would have said Thornton looked calm, and that the men Thornton killed had never harmed him in any way. The truth of what was in Thornton's mind, whether it was genuine grievance, wounded pride, an attempt to justify the theft, a deeper instability, or some tangle of all of them, went into the locked office with him and did not come out. What can be said without dispute is the sequence itself, and how ordinary it appeared right up until the moment it was not. There was a theft, caught on video. There was a disciplinary hearing, conducted with a union representative present to protect the employees' interests. There was a resolution, a resignation signed, a question asked about references, a final paycheck confirmed, a handshake's worth of process completed. There was even a small human touch in the request for a glass of water on the way out the door. And then, in the space between the hallway and the kitchen sink, everything turned. A workplace dispute that had, by all appearances, been settled through the proper channels became the deadliest workplace killing Connecticut had ever seen. The union representative who had spent that morning speaking on Thornton's behalf was among the first to die. The people in the warehouse had no part in the hearing at all. They were simply there, at a shift change, when a man who had just agreed to resign decided that resignation was not enough. Hartford Distributors, the family business that had sponsored local teams and been a fixture in Manchester, absorbed a wound it would never fully heal. 8 families lost husbands, fathers, and sons. The case entered the record alongside the other workplace tragedies of its era, studied and argued over for what it revealed about race, about theft, about the human capacity to smile through a meeting while carrying 2 loaded handguns in a lunchbox. The most dangerous person in that warehouse on the morning of August 3, 2010, had walked in as a man about to lose his job, sat calmly through the process that ended it, and then, on his way out the door, reached into the lunch he had packed that morning and made sure that he would not be the only one who did not go home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to a university biology department in Huntsville, Alabama, in early 2010. A professor who had been denied tenure and who had exhausted her appeals sat quietly through a routine faculty meeting for nearly an hour. Then she stood up, pulled a pistol from her purse, and began shooting the colleagues sitting closest to her. Case 8, Amy Bishop. She sat through most of the meeting before she started killing. For nearly an hour on the afternoon of February 12, 2010, Amy Bishop sat quietly at a routine meeting of the biology department at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, a gathering of about 12 people that had nothing to do with her grievance. Then she stood, took a 9mm pistol from her purse, and began shooting the colleagues nearest to her. In a span of minutes, she killed 3 faculty members and wounded 3 others before her weapon reportedly jammed and she was forced out of the room. The grievance behind it was one of the most familiar in academic life. Bishop, a biology professor, had been denied tenure, and with that denial, her career at the university was ending. What she did about it was not familiar at all. Bishop was in her mid-40s, a Harvard-trained neurobiologist, and a mother of 4. Before coming to Alabama, she had been an instructor at Harvard Medical School, and she joined the faculty of the University of Alabama in Huntsville's Department of Biological Sciences as an assistant professor in 2003. She was, by the accounts of those who worked with her, an unusual presence. Some colleagues described her as strange, as someone who interrupted meetings with odd, off-topic remarks. One of them, who sat on her tenure review committee, went so far as to call her crazy, and after the shooting he did not retract the description, saying he had said it multiple times and stood by it, describing a woman with a pattern of erratic behavior who did things that were not normal and seemed out of touch with reality. She was reportedly a poor instructor and unpopular among her students. Alongside her scientific work, she had another life as an aspiring novelist and had written several unpublished novels. One of them, in a detail that reads as chilling in hindsight, featured a woman scientist working to defeat a pandemic virus while struggling with suicidal thoughts at the prospect of not earning tenure. The central conflict of her time at the university was the tenure decision. In academic careers, tenure is the threshold that separates a permanent, protected position from a temporary one, and for a professor on the tenure track, being denied it is effectively the end of the road at that institution. In March 2009, Bishop was denied tenure at Huntsville. Under university policy, that meant the spring 2010 semester would be her last there. She did not accept the decision quietly. She appealed to the university's administration, which, without reviewing the substance of her tenure application, determined that the process had been carried out according to policy and denied her appeal. She did not stop there. She approached members of the university system's board of trustees. She hired a lawyer who, by her husband's account, was finding one problem after another with the process. When she learned that the colleague who had called her crazy had done so during her tenure review, she filed a complaint with the Federal Equal Employment Opportunity Commission alleging sex discrimination, citing that remark as possible evidence. Her husband described the tenure fight as a long, hard battle and said the looming loss of her position had distressed her deeply. He believed she had exceeded the qualifications for tenure. The university had concluded otherwise, and by early 2010 her avenues of appeal had run out. There was also, though almost no one in Huntsville knew it at the time, a history that would resurface with terrible force after the shooting. In 1986, when Bishop was 20 years old, she had shot and killed her own 18-year-old brother, Seth, at the family home in Braintree, Massachusetts. At the time, authorities concluded that the shooting was an accident. Bishop had told police she was trying to unload her father's gun when it discharged, and she was released. That was where the matter had rested for more than 2 decades. There was another episode as well, in 2002, when Bishop was involved in an altercation at a restaurant in Peabody, Massachusetts. Another customer had taken the last available booster seat, and when the woman would not give it up, Bishop punched her in the head while shouting that she was Dr. Amy Bishop. She pleaded guilty to assault and received probation. These incidents, an accidental shooting and a violent outburst over a booster seat, had not prevented her from building an academic career. The university did not perform background checks on faculty when Bishop was hired, and even afterward officials suggested that a routine check would not necessarily have surfaced anything alarming. The faculty meeting on February 12, 2010, was an ordinary departmental gathering. Roughly a dozen people were present. It was, by every account, unrelated to Bishop's tenure situation. She sat through the meeting for a considerable stretch, perhaps most of an hour, giving no sign of what she was about to do. Then, without warning, she rose, drew the pistol, and opened fire on the people sitting closest to her. 3 of her colleagues were killed. Gopi Podila, the chairman of the biology department and Bishop's boss, died. So did Maria Ragland Davis and Adriel Johnson, both professors in the department. 3 others were wounded, a microbiology professor named Joseph Leahy, who was shot in the head and suffered a traumatic brain injury that left him blind in one eye, a staff assistant named Stephanie Monticholo, and an assistant professor named Luis Cruz Vera. The shooting reportedly ended when Bishop's gun jammed. Colleagues managed to get her out of the room, and one of those present, a professor who witnessed the roughly 10-minute ordeal, would spend years afterward struggling with post-traumatic stress, unable to enjoy the sounds of fireworks or the 4th of July because of what they recalled. Bishop was taken into custody by Huntsville police shortly after the shooting, and police confiscated her computer, the family's minivan, and a large binder full of documents relating to what was described as her tenure battle. The case took a turn back into the past almost immediately. In the wake of the Huntsville shooting, authorities in Massachusetts reopened the 1986 death of Seth Bishop. After a fresh look and an inquest, prosecutors concluded there was probable cause to believe Bishop had committed a crime in her brother's death, and she was indicted. But the case could not proceed because the statute of limitations had expired. The accidental shooting of a brother that had been closed for more than 20 years was now viewed very differently, in light of what his sister had done in a faculty meeting in Alabama, but the law no longer allowed it to be tried. For the Huntsville killings, Bishop was charged with 1 count of capital murder involving 2 or more people and 3 counts of attempted murder. She initially pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and her attorneys argued that she had mental problems. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, but the families of some of the victims opposed a death sentence, and in the face of that opposition, the case was resolved through a plea. On September 11, 2012, Amy Bishop pleaded guilty to the charges. Under Alabama law, even a guilty plea in a capital case requires a form of proceeding before a jury, essentially a condensed trial in which the jury hears the evidence and is told the defendant has pleaded guilty. That jury heard the evidence on September 24, 2012, and returned its verdict quickly, in well under an hour. That same day, Bishop was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the capital murder charge, along with life sentences for the attempted murder charges. In the years since, Bishop has pursued a long series of appeals, and in doing so she has repeatedly reconsidered and tried to walk back her guilty plea. She has complained about her lawyers and claimed that she was mentally ill at the time she entered the plea. She has blamed a combination of factors for the shooting itself, including schizophrenia, allergies and steroids she said she had been taking. In one appeal, she argued that her conviction should be overturned based on claims, citing a British medical journal, that steroids prescribed for allergies could cause psychiatric effects. In her court filings, she wrote that she had lifelong allergies and mental health problems, and that during the stressful tenure period, her allergies flared, causing blackouts and hallucinations, and that she had learned of her crime only after one such blackout. Alabama courts have rejected these appeals. In 2015, 5 years after the shooting, she offered an apology for the first time, including a handwritten note in a court filing that referred to the shootings as a terrible crime and expressed sorrow for the victims, their families, and her own family. One of the survivors, the microbiology professor who had been shot in the head, rejected the apology, saying that Dr. Bishop had ceased to exist in his world, that she simply did not exist for him anymore. The University of Alabama in Huntsville was changed permanently by that afternoon. The institution began performing background checks on faculty afterward, a practice it had not followed when Bishop was hired. It examined how it supported people who were denied tenure, offering counseling through employee assistance programs, and trying, at the department level, to help those who did not receive tenure find other employment. The university has held days of remembrance for the 3 faculty members who were killed, marking the anniversary in a garden along the campus greenway. But no policy change could undo what had happened, and the survivors carried the wounds forward into their lives and their work. One of them, the professor who witnessed the shooting and developed post-traumatic stress, turned his own experience into a subject of study, coming over the years to see what Bishop did, less purely as a crime and more as the product of a disease. The Bishop case stands apart from many of the others in this collection. It did not take place in a warehouse or a factory or a restaurant, and the person who pulled the trigger was not a laborer or a driver, but a Harvard-trained scientist with a doctorate and 4 children. Yet, at its core, it followed the same grim logic. There was a workplace decision, the denial of tenure, that meant the loss of a job. There was a person who could not accept that decision, who appealed and complained and fought it through every available channel, and who, when all of those channels were exhausted, chose violence instead. The colleagues she killed had, in her mind, become the enemy, the people responsible for ending her career, even though the meeting she chose for the attack had nothing to do with her tenure at all. Gopi Podila, Maria Ragland Davis, and Adriel Johnson had come to a routine departmental meeting on a Friday afternoon, the kind of gathering that happens on every campus in the country, and 3 of them did not leave the room alive. The most dangerous person in that meeting was the professor sitting quietly among them, waiting, with a pistol in her purse and a binder full of grievances at home. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves to Southern California in the winter of 2013, where a former police officer, who believed he had been unfairly fired, posted a lengthy manifesto online and declared war on the department he blamed. His first victims were not officers at all, but the daughter of the man who had represented him at his dismissal hearing, and her fiancé. Case 9. Christopher Dorner. His entire war was about a firing. Christopher Dorner had been dismissed from the Los Angeles Police Department in 2008 after a review board concluded that he had falsely accused his training officer of using excessive force on a suspect. Dorner insisted the accusation was true and that his termination was retaliation for reporting misconduct. He appealed, he sued, he lost. And when every legal avenue had closed, he did something no fired employee in memory had done. In February 2013, he posted a manifesto online declaring what he called unconventional and asymmetric warfare against the LAPD, its officers, and their families, and then he began killing people. Over the course of 9 days, he killed 4 people and wounded 3 others, and he set off one of the largest manhunts in California history. His first victims were not police officers at all. They were the daughter of the man who had represented him at his dismissal hearing, and her fiancé. Dorner was 33 years old, born on June 4, 1979. He had served in the United States Navy Reserve, rising to the rank of lieutenant, and he brought military training and firearms proficiency to everything that followed. He had joined the LAPD and become a sworn officer, but his time on the force was short and bitterly contested. During his training, he reported his field training officer for what he claimed was the kicking of a mentally ill suspect during an arrest. The department investigated and concluded that Dorner's allegation was not credible, and in 2008 he was terminated for making a false statement. In his own telling, the sequence was reversed. He believed he had been punished for telling the truth, that a culture of racism and retaliation within the department had targeted him for daring to report a fellow officer, and that his firing was the corrupt result. He appealed his dismissal through the department's Board of Rights process, and he was represented at that hearing by a retired lapped captain named Randall Kwan, who by that time was working as an attorney. The board upheld the firing. Dorner later challenged the outcome in court, and in 2011 the California Court of Appeal rejected his appeal, noting that under state law the department's findings were entitled to a presumption of correctness and that Dorner had failed to prove they were wrong. For most people, that would have been the end of a long and painful chapter. For Dorner, it became the justification for everything he did next. He came to believe that Randall Kwan, the man who had represented him, had failed to defend his interests and had instead served the interests of the department. In the 11,000-word document he posted to social media, which became known as his manifesto, he laid out his history, his grievances, and his intentions in extraordinary detail. He named more than 30 law enforcement personnel he considered targets, along with their families. He wrote that he would not be alive to see his name cleared, and that clearing his name was what the whole thing was about. He declared that he had never had the opportunity to have a family of his own, and that he was therefore going to terminate the families of those he blamed. It was a chilling inversion of a grievance most people carry silently. A fired employee who had decided that if he could not have his career and his good name back, he would take the lives of the people he held responsible and their children. The violence began before most of the public even knew his name. On January 23, 2013, a police chief in the small city of La Palma received a package from Dorner containing a one-page note and a video. Around the same time, a similar package arrived at CNN, addressed to the journalist Anderson Cooper. That package contained a DVD stating Dorner's case against the Lapped, along with a bullet-riddled challenge coin that had been issued by a former Lapped chief, and a note inscribed with a notation implying he had shot the coin at 100 yards to boast of his accuracy with a rifle. On February 1st, Dorner formally separated from the Navy. Surveillance footage from that period showed him buying scuba tanks and other gear. He was preparing. On the evening of Sunday, February 3, 2013, Dorner committed his first killings. Monica Kwan, who was 28, and her fiancé Keith Lawrence, who was 27, were shot to death as they sat in their car on the top floor of the parking structure at their condominium complex in Irvine, California. Both were struck by multiple gunshots. Monica Kwan was an assistant women's basketball coach at Cal State Fullerton. She was also the daughter of Randall Kwan, the retired captain and attorney who had represented Dorner at his dismissal hearing. Keith Lawrence was a public safety officer at the University of Southern California. Neither of them had any personal connection to Dorner's grievance. Monica had been a child, in effect, when her father sat across a hearing room from Dorner. She was killed because of who her father was, and her fiancé was killed because he was beside her. At first, the double homicide seemed random, an inexplicable attack on a young, engaged couple. It was only when Dorner's manifesto surfaced the next day that the meaning became clear. In it, he had specifically named Randall Kwan and his family as targets, accusing Kwan of having failed to represent his interests. That link led the Irvine police to name Dorner as the prime suspect in the murders of Monica Kwan and Keith Lawrence, and it set off the enormous response that followed. On February 6, the Lapped publicly identified Dorner and released the manifesto, warning that he was armed, extremely dangerous, and believed to have multiple weapons. The department set up protection details for more than 40 potential targets named in the document, and thousands of officers were assigned to patrol highways across Southern California. The Lapped even pulled its patrol officers off motorcycles for their own protection. A man's grievance over his firing had turned into a regional emergency. 4 days after killing Monica Kwan and Keith Lawrence, Dorner struck again, this time directly at law enforcement. On February 7th, in Riverside, he ambushed 2 Riverside Police Department officers, killing patrolman Michael Crane and seriously wounding the other. In roughly the same window of time, he fired on other officers as well. The city was gripped by fear, and the fear itself produced further tragedy. Officers assigned to guard the home of a captain named in Dorner's manifesto opened fire on a blue pickup truck in the pre-dawn hours in Torrance, believing it was Dorner's vehicle. Inside were an elderly woman and her daughter delivering newspapers. One suffered a minor wound and the other was shot twice, in what the Lap chief later called a tragic case of mistaken identity. Less than an hour later, Torrance police officers opened fire on another driver, also mistaken for Dorner, who had merely been on his way to pick up a friend to go surfing. The manhunt had become so charged that innocent people were being shot by the very officers searching for the man who was shooting officers. Dorner also taunted those he had targeted. 4 days after killing Monica Kwan, and just hours after killing Officer Crane, a man identifying himself as Dorner called Randall Kwan and told him he should have done a better job of protecting his daughter. It was a cruelty layered on top of murder, a man calling the grieving father of a woman he had killed to blame him for her death. The call was traced to Washington State, though authorities did not believe Dorner was actually there, a sign of how difficult he was proving to track. For a time it appeared he might have fled the region entirely, or even the country. A federal complaint noted that a suspect matching his description had been seen attempting to flee toward Mexico, and there were reports placing him in various locations. But the manhunt eventually converged on the San Bernardino Mountains, near the resort community of Big Bear Lake, about 100 miles east of Los Angeles. Dorner had abandoned his burned-out truck in the area after it developed a broken axle, and investigators recovered assault rifles from the wreckage. In the mountains, he broke into homes, tied up residents, and at one point carjacked a vehicle. Notably, through all of this, he did not harm the civilians he encountered in the mountains. He saved his violence for the police. The end came on February 12, 2013. Dorner was cornered by law enforcement in a cabin in the woods. A couple who had been in a nearby cabin, Karen and Jim Reynolds, had been tied up and briefly held captive by a man they later described as Dorner, and their eventual escape helped pinpoint his location. A shootout erupted between Dorner and San Bernardino County Sheriff's deputies. During that firefight, Detective Jeremiah McKay, who was 35, was killed and another deputy was wounded. The cabin caught fire during the confrontation, and Dorner died inside. His charred remains were positively identified 2 days later, on February 14. He had killed 4 people in all: Monica Kwan, Keith Lawrence, Officer Michael Crane, and Detective Jeremiah McKay. 3 others had been wounded by him directly, and 2 more, the newspaper delivery women, had been shot by police who mistook them for him. The aftermath was as complicated as the manhunt had been chaotic. Even as the killings horrified the public, Dorner's underlying complaints about the Lapt prompted genuine soul-searching. In the middle of the crisis, the Lapt announced it would reopen the case of Dorner's firing, with the chief taking pains to say the decision was not made to appease a murderer, but to reassure the public that the department was transparent and fair, and to confront what he called the ghosts of the department's past. Months later, a review found widespread concern within the Lapt that its internal disciplinary process was inconsistent and that it discriminated based on gender, race, and rank. The department also faced hard questions about the reckless use of deadly force during the manhunt itself, most glaringly in the shooting of the 2 women delivering newspapers, whose lawsuit the city settled for millions of dollars. Dorner became, disturbingly, a figure who attracted a measure of online sympathy, with some people separating his grievances about police conduct from the murders he committed. He was, at once, a man who had killed 4 innocent people over a personal grudge, and a symbol that a portion of the public seized upon to voice their own distrust of the police. None of that changed what had actually happened to the victims. Monica Kwan was a young coach at the start of her life, engaged to be married. Keith Lawrence was a public safety officer who happened to love her. Michael Crane was a Riverside patrolman ambushed at his post. Jeremiah McKay was a detective who died in a mountain shootout. Not one of them had any hand in Christopher Dorner's firing. Monica Kwan was killed for the accident of her parentage. The officers were killed as symbols of an institution. The manifesto's logic, that the families of those Dorner blamed were legitimate targets, was the logic of a man who had convinced himself that his ruined career justified the destruction of other people's lives. The Dorner case stands as the most extreme illustration of what a workplace grievance can become when it is nursed, magnified, and armed. Most disputes over a firing end in an appeal, a lawsuit, a period of anger, and eventually some kind of moving on. Dorner's ended with a manifesto declaring war, A 9-day rampage across 4 counties, thousands of officers deployed, dozens of families placed under guard, innocent bystanders shot by police, and 5 people dead, including Dorner himself. At the center of all of it was a single conviction that never wavered, the belief that he had been wrongly stripped of his job and his good name. He wrote that clearing his name was what it was all about. In the end, his name was cleared of nothing. What it became attached to was the deaths of a basketball coach, her fiancé, a patrolman, and a detective, and the terror of a region held hostage by one man's refusal to accept that his career was over. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case moves to a granite and marble shop in Edgewood, Maryland, in the fall of 2017. A machine operator who believed his co-workers had been mocking and startling him gathered a small group of them together one morning, telling them he wanted to say something to everybody. Without another word, he opened fire and then drove across state lines to find one more person from his past. Case 10. Raddy Prince. The last words his co-workers heard before he started shooting were an invitation. On the morning of October 18, 2017, at a granite and marble fabrication shop in Edgewood, Maryland, Raddy Prince gathered a small group of the men he worked with, telling them something like, "Come with me, I want to say something to everybody." When they had assembled around him, he said nothing more. He took out a handgun and opened fire, shooting 5 of them in the head in the span of about 6 seconds. 3 of them died. Then Prince walked out, got into his vehicle, and drove across state lines into Delaware, where he shot a 6th man, someone from an earlier chapter of his working life, before a manhunt finally ended with his arrest. The dispute at the heart of it was, in his telling, that his co-workers had been picking on him. In the telling of everyone else, there was no dispute at all worth killing over. Prince was in his late 30s at the time of the shooting, and he came to that morning with a long and troubling history behind him. He had a prior criminal record, including a conviction years earlier, in Delaware, on multiple counts of 3rd-degree burglary, for which he had served time. He had also, earlier in 2017, been fired from a different granite and marble company after he punched a co-worker and threatened others. His former boss at that company had been so frightened of Prince after the firing that he tried to obtain a restraining order against him, a request a judge did not grant. This was, in other words, a man with a documented pattern of workplace violence and intimidation, someone whose previous employment had ended with a co-worker punched and a boss so alarmed he went to court. When Prince was hired at Advanced Granite Solutions, a countertop company in the Emerton Business Park in Edgewood, he had been there only about 4 months, working as a machine operator when the killings occurred. The question of what actually motivated the shooting became one of the central issues of the case, because Prince's own account and the accounts of nearly everyone else diverged sharply. Prince would later claim that his co-workers had been bullying him, that they were deliberately bumping into him and startling him, and that on the morning of the shooting, he feared their behavior would escalate. He said he called the group of workers together to see whether they could coexist, and that he acted out of fear for his life, describing it as a moment of kill or be killed. His defense would build on this, along with a deeper argument about his mental state. His attorneys said Prince had been the victim of a 2014 assault outside a nightclub that left him with a mild brain injury to his frontal lobe, the part of the brain associated with emotional control and judgment, and that he had become paranoid, mistrustful, and prone to talking to himself in the years afterward. They argued he suffered from major depression with psychotic features, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a judgment-impairing brain injury. The prosecution and the witnesses saw something very different. Co-workers described Prince not as a bullied man, but as the source of friction himself. When he arrived that Wednesday morning, according to one worker who had been at the company for a year and a half, Prince responded to a polite greeting with harsh language about the company and its workers. Several of the employees had complained to supervisors before that day about Prince's behavior. One of the men Prince killed, according to that victim's daughter, had often expressed concern about Prince and his abusive conduct in the workplace. The picture the prosecution painted was not of a persecuted man finally pushed too far, but of a hostile and volatile worker who had turned an ordinary job into something his colleagues feared, and who then decided to kill the people he blamed for the way that fear was coming back on him. The morning of the shooting followed a sequence that witnesses were able to reconstruct in detail. Prince arrived at work around the usual time. At some point, he walked out to his vehicle and put on a black jacket, then came back inside and stood near a machine with an odd look on his face. A worker who survived recalled Prince calling his name and asking him and his colleagues to come toward him, gathering the small group with the invitation to say something to everybody. The witness said he was nervous and believed he himself may have been a target. Prince had, without the others realizing it, retrieved his weapon and concealed it in the jacket. Once the group had gathered around, he began firing almost immediately. Within about 10 seconds, he shot all of them in the head. A sheriff's investigator would later testify that there had been 5 shots fired at specific targets, and a responding officer described the scene he encountered as something like a scene from a horror movie. The 3 men who died were Bayar Saikan Tudev, who was 53 and lived in Virginia, Jose Hidalgo Romero, who was 34 and was sometimes known as Oscar, from Aberdeen, Maryland, and Enis Methovoljak, who was 48, from Dundalk, Maryland. All 3 were granite polishers, working men who had come to the shop that morning to do their jobs. 2 others, Jose Roberto Flores Guillen of Edgewood and Enoch Sosa of Northeast, were shot and gravely wounded, but survived, both of them, like the dead, struck in the head. The victims and their families were described by those who knew them as humble and hard-working people, the kind of workers who make up the backbone of a small fabrication business. They had done nothing to Prince beyond, in some cases, complaining to supervisors about his behavior, and for that, in his mind, they had become enemies to be eliminated. Prince did not stop at the shop. After the shooting, he fled the scene and drove north into Delaware, and by the account of the psychiatrist who later evaluated him, he was careful during that drive to stay under the speed limit so that police would not have a reason to pull him over. It was the behavior of a man thinking clearly and trying to avoid capture, not a man in the grip of a blackout. Along the way, he stopped at a store to buy ammunition and cigarettes. Then he went to a used car dealership in the Wilmington area, where a man he had previously worked with was employed, and shot that man in the head as well. The 6th victim of the day survived his wound. The 2 attacks, one in Maryland and one in Delaware, set off a manhunt that stretched along the Interstate 95 corridor in the Northeast, involving federal agents and multiple police agencies, and put businesses and schools in the Edgewood area on lockdown for a time. The manhunt lasted about 10 hours. That evening, Prince was spotted walking in a town in Delaware. When officers approached, he discarded the handgun and fled on foot, but he was captured after a brief chase in Newark, Delaware, and taken into custody. 380 caliber semi-automatic pistol he threw away was recovered, and investigators determined it was the same weapon used in both the Maryland and Delaware shootings, the shell casings at the 2 scenes matching. The gun that had killed 3 men and wounded 3 others across 2 states was now in police hands, and the man who had carried it was in custody. The prosecutions that followed took place in 2 states, and in an unusual order. Prince was tried first in Delaware for the shooting at the car dealership, rather than in Maryland where he faced 3 murder charges, in part because of the possibility that a Delaware conviction could result in a lengthy sentence. In May 2018, a Delaware jury found him guilty of attempted manslaughter in that shooting, and he was sentenced to 40 years in prison. During that sentencing, Prince told the judge he needed treatment for mental illness. Only after the Delaware case was resolved was he returned to Harford County, Maryland, to face trial for the killings at Advanced Granite Solutions. That Maryland trial took place in the fall of 2020. Prince was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, along with firearms offences, including possession of a regulated firearm by a person disqualified from having one. His defence pursued Maryland's version of the insanity defence, arguing that he was not criminally responsible because of his mental illness and brain injury. The 2 sides presented dueling psychiatric evaluations. A defense expert testified that Prince suffered from major depression with psychotic features, post-traumatic stress disorder, and a brain injury that impaired his judgment. The prosecution's expert reached a very different conclusion, testifying that Prince did not suffer from a severe mental illness that met the legal standard, but rather from post-traumatic stress disorder and antisocial personality disorder. Antisocial personality disorder, characterized by deceitfulness, lack of remorse, and irritability, cannot be used as a basis for the insanity defense under Maryland law. The prosecution's expert described Prince as a man with a lifelong issue with a bad temper, who blamed others for his behavior. He also testified that when he interviewed Prince did express remorse, but not for the people he had shot. The remorse he expressed was for himself, that he had been caught. On October 28, 2020, the jury found Rady Prince guilty of 3 counts of first-degree murder and 2 counts of attempted first-degree murder, along with the firearms charges. In the second phase of the trial, the jury and then the judge rejected his insanity plea, finding him criminally responsible for what he had done. He was ultimately sentenced to multiple life terms for the murders, with additional years for the firearms offences stacked on top, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The 40-year Delaware sentence and the Maryland life sentences together closed the door on any possibility of his release. The Advanced Granite case is, in some ways, the most stripped-down illustration of this collection's central theme. There was no dramatic firing on the day of the shooting, no disciplinary hearing, no garnished paycheck, no denied tenure. There was only a man who had been at a small shop for 4 months, who believed his co-workers were mocking and startling him, and who decided to answer that perceived slight by gathering the men together and shooting them in the head. The sheriff who investigated said afterward that no one had anticipated any issue when Prince came to work that day, that no one thought something like this would unfold. That is what makes the case so chilling. The warning signs existed, in the abstract, in Prince's history: a previous firing for punching a co-worker, a former boss frightened enough to seek a restraining order, complaints from colleagues at the new job. But on the specific morning it happened, the men who died had no reason to believe that answering a co-worker's request to gather around would be the last thing they ever did. Bayar Saikan Tudev, Jose Hidalgo Romero, and Enis Mavoljak were granite polishers, working men who had immigrated or built their lives around steady labor, who had come to a business park in Edgewood to shape stone and go home to their families. One of them had told his own daughter he was worried about the man who would kill him. They died because a co-worker with a bad temper and a history of violence had decided that being bumped into on a shop floor, real or imagined, was reason enough to end their lives. The most dangerous person at Advanced Granite Solutions had walked out to his car for a jacket, come back in, and called the others over with the promise that he wanted to say something to everybody. 10 workplaces, 10 disputes that most people would have absorbed and moved past, a reprimand, a garnished paycheck, a lost job, a denied promotion, a schedule no one wanted, a co-worker who bumped into someone on the floor. In each of them, one person decided the grievance was worth more than the lives of the people around them. The victims were, almost without exception, people who had simply come to work. They were sorting mail and running presses and cleaning restaurants and sitting in meetings and polishing stone. They had no part in the resentment that would kill them, and no warning that the most dangerous person in the building was already inside, clocked in, and counting the minutes. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.